Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Forum for Excellence 2021. My name is Molly Cook with the Forum for Excellence Planning Committee. I'll be the moderator for today's session, and I am joined by Dawn Hughes, who is providing tech support. This breakout session is M3 assessment. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started with our presenters. All of our attendees have the ability to unmute yourselves, but we ask that you refrain from doing this until the end of the session during our Q&A portion. If you have questions or comments as the session proceeds, please post those in the Zoom chat and not the Whova chat. You can access today's presentation on the Whova app. This session will be recorded, and you can locate the recording on our Forum for Excellence website following the end of the conference. We will post this website in the chat, but you can also access it on the Whova app under Resources and Forum page. If you are looking for a certificate of PD, those will come 2 weeks after the conference. If you need a certificate of PD, your name will need to be accurate in this Zoom meeting for attendance purposes. Now I would like to introduce you to Nancy and Sheridan, who will be our speakers today. Thank you so much for presenting.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Molly, for getting us started here today. So I'm Sheridan Lane. I am the director of the Culinary and Hospitality program here at Lincoln Land Community College, and I am joined by Nancy Sweet. Please introduce yourself, Nancy.
Sure, and if you want to advance to the next slide. My name is Nancy Sweet. I am the Dean of our Workforce Institute. Just to give you a little more background, we are at Lincoln Land Community College in Springfield, Illinois, so kind of in the middle of the state. Some more demographics about us. We have about 12,000 students that we serve annually, fluctuates between 12 to 12.5. It's actually the largest community college district in Illinois in terms of landmass. We cover all or parts of 15 different counties. 22, a little bit over 22% of our student body is minority, and we serve about of our student body, 23% is occupational or vocational type programs. So if you want to advance. So you came today on a session on an assessment. I think it asked the question when you came in, you know, kind of what is kind of a first word that comes to you when you think of assessment? I know that traditionally at our school, it hasn't been like, hooray, yay, I can't wait to get to this. It's been more of a collective groan, right? And so with that collective groan, it was just total disengagement from a lot of our faculty. It was something that seemed to almost be a flavor of the month with us here at Lincoln Land. And whoever was kind of spearheading that assessment that year would have kind of their own methods, and there didn't seem to be some long-term consistency. And it certainly didn't seem like it filtered over to workforce. We were kind of on this island by ourselves that kind of struggled to break in. Faculty knew that if they kind of waited it out long enough, that flavor of the month or flavor of the semester would change. And so that was kind of just a waiting game, right? And see to how long they could play that system until it really didn't have to get done, because it wasn't a system that worked for them. So 2 years ago, there was very little formal assessment going on in workforce, and no buy-in at all. And that disengagement was still there. So if you want to advance. I started as the dean about 2 years ago. I'd been in the culinary program as the director before that for about 8 years. And as I moved into this role, and Sharon moved in the director role, and also as our area assessment coordinator, she and I tasked ourselves with making assessment that was workable, that people didn't just kind of totally gloss over, and actually utilized it in a way that mattered. Because when we had assessment going on, most of the campus, most of the faculty, those transfer students that make up the bulk of us, were focused on the gen eds, right? And when we talk about gen eds, we might be thinking about digital literacy, critical thinking, literacy in general. And of course, we need to assess for those too. But we've got to make sure that we're assessing so that we're meeting industry needs, right? Because industry drives our bus, and that's the only way we can continue to create value is by assessing and improving programs to drive that value for industry, to make our programs valuable to students and meet our community needs. And you know, many of our assessments in CTE, they're more black and white. If you're looking at understanding tool or equipment safety, or understanding a wiring diagram, or demonstrating knife skills, those are kind of hard and fast. Whereas some of those general education courses, the systems for assessing those may not mesh or align as easily as we'd like them to. So we made our own system of assessment that we think has actually been received pretty well by a faculty. In fact, we've heard them say things like, this is the easiest assessment's ever been since I've been at Lincoln Land. So for Sharon and I, that was a huge win. So if you want to advance to the next slide, the concept that we created was that we're making assessment kind of M cubed or M3. So it's manageable, measurable, and meaningful. With the manageable, we wanted to reduce complexities. We want faculty to have a clear picture of what it is we're looking to get out of this, what exactly the process is, and a system that they feel is actually approachable and workable. We want to be measurable because, right, we're trying to make data-driven decisions these days. We're not just doing things because it feels right. We want there to be a system so that pulling that data is convenient, that data is objective, it's demonstrative, and it allows us to be usable for action steps, which is that next part. It's meaningful, right? We don't want faculty to feel they're just spinning their wheels and this is just another box we check. We want it to actually drive good decision making. So it can drive that value within our programs for both students and employers, because there's got to be value on both ends of that. So we want faculty to be able to easily identify those gaps in learning, what those data gaps show, and be able to input solutions or action plans, and then use that to document for evidence for continuous improvement. Because as we know, evidence is important, whether it's program review time, HLC accreditation time. So be able to really show that we're closing gaps in student learning is critical for us. So if you actually want to advance it one more, there's another part of that slide. So we've created a system that reduce complexities, create a system that works for us as workforce CTE people. And that has created buy-in from faculty, and it's caused all of us to be making data-driven decisions. And so we really wanted to focus on the idea as well. It's about quality over quantity. Before it seemed like a race that if we assess everything, we're busy, we're getting stuff done, that's going to be effective, but that wasn't the case. Sharon and I constantly implored faculty to, just kind of dial it back. Less is more. It allows that be able to take a really good focus, allows for the quality for greater analysis, for more reflection, and ideally for them to create a better action plan that leads to real improvements. So in our next slide, Sheridan's going to kind of start talking about, well, how it is that we actually made that happen.
Yeah, so thank you, Nancy, for that kind of background and introduction. So when we're talking about assessment, I think Nancy said it best when she was speaking earlier, that our colleagues were like, what, another thing, now we're back to that again. And so that process of getting them on board is what we're really trying to share with you today. And as we named the presentation that Nancy mentioned, manageable, measurable, meaningful, we hope that you see how we've tried to simplify that. And certainly, this is a work in progress. So what we're presenting moving forward, if you have thoughts or suggestions or things that you're doing in your institutions that would further those goals that we've kind of set out doing, we'd love to hear back from you. So if you could post those in the chat, that'd be great. And if you know Nancy and I very well, both of us, I don't know whether it's coming out of the culinary and hospitality world, but we're very hands-on and get going and get started and dive right in. And that's where this slide comes from, is that assessment doesn't have to be this big, complicated, systemic process. It just has to mean that you get started. And the way that we chose to get started is really to look at what, exactly what we're teaching. So at the very bottom of that arrow, you see where it says level up outcomes. And what essentially we did with the help of our support team is to pull together all of those outcomes by course and take a look at those. This is the class, these are the outcomes that are associated with that class, And now let's think what those outcomes really mean for this course. And that's where that level up came into play. And we just adopted this idea of, is it an introductory course level outcome? Is it a reinforced course level outcome? Or is it an emphasis level outcome? And that's where, those levels, and we implored our staff to take responsibility for each one of the courses that they teach and come up with some ideas around that. So that was our first task, leveling up the outcomes. And then the next task in our process was to look at how those outcomes are related to our program as a whole. And, it was kind of interesting to see people think through that process, how they're related. For many of us, those outcomes were very related to the outcomes of the particular program, only because meeting the needs of those outcomes were directly tied to many of the certifications or licensures that were needed in those various areas. And then once we were able to level those outcomes, map them to our program goals, then we, our next task to Workforce Institute was to identify those assessments that they were theoretically already doing. And then there was some learning in that process. So, lots of folks were like, well, is assessment the same as grading? And so there was some learning there about what assessment truly should be. I think I'm a fairly new mom, and, you see those Facebook posts of like the babies in the circles, and it's like, oh, look how they've grown. And that's kind of where we framed where assessment should be. And that's what we really wanted to make sure that our staff understood, that assessment is not about necessarily grading the students. And it can be, but it doesn't have to always be. And it isn't a means of like grading ourselves. It's about how can we continuously push our programs forward. So in part of that process, this was not an overnight process. So that's why that little time for work sticker is in this slide, because that's actually meaningful. We set aside time in our department meetings for folks to work on this. We recognize that in many of our busy schedules, if we want to actually prioritize something, we have to set time aside to get it done. And so that's what we did. And that even meant like Nancy and I splitting up and working with small groups to try and make that happen, despite initially maybe some pushback. And I think once we were able to articulate kind of where we were going with this assessment and how we were going to make it, as Nancy mentioned earlier, measurable and meaningful most importantly, then we could kind of move up this arrow on this slide. So the next 3 slides, if you could advance it to the next one, you're going to see 3 slides that look very similar, okay? So I'm challenging our audience to take a look at these 3 slides. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to take a look at each slide. And I want you to kind of notice how they're similar and how they're different. Okay, so I'm going to start counting the 30 seconds, and then we're going to advance to the next slide, and then the next slide, and then we'll come back and talk about it, okay? So it looks like my timer's going, so 30 seconds go, and it may be a fast 30 seconds. Okay, go to the next one. Okay, go to the next one. Okay, those were fast 30 seconds, I know, but if you'd like to post in the chat anybody that can observe what might be the difference between these slides, hopefully you're noticing a couple of different things. So if we could go back to the first digging in. Okay, as I mentioned before, Nancy and I come out of the culinary and hospitality, so we actually like to get our hands on things. And that's kind of where this came into play. We encouraged our staff to get into assessment and to start taking risks in the idea of analyzing assessment. So we collected data, we looked at data, and then we really focused on putting data to work for that emphasis level course learning outcome cycle. So if you notice something through these slides, you saw year 1, year 2, year 3. So that 3-year cycle was very important. We weren't trying to assess everything and to dig into that data for all of those course learning outcomes for all of our courses. We weren't going to try and do that in 1 year, but we thought it would be meaningful to start in that cycle and really start with the emphasis specifically. And the reason that we started with the emphasis is because we, as a Workforce Institute, rely, as Nancy mentioned earlier, on program advisory committee meetings to give input and impart their industry changing knowledge to our programs so that they can continue to be, fresh and up to date and, with the most important skills as presented by industry leaders. So that being said, the emphasis level outcomes, we put that first so that we could then turn right around, and that's where this little Pac-Man is in here, and talk to our program advisory committee meetings, PAC meetings, and say, hey, is this really what you want us to teach? Are these the outcomes, the emphasis level outcomes that you really think are most important? And, is this where our data should be? And, we're in the process of kind of looking at those, the data related to those outcomes among all of our program advisory committee meetings. And we look forward to kind of being able to share that data in an upcoming professional development time that we have in the near future. That being said, if you advance the slide. Okay. So you notice the second year says proceed to the next route because it's the route is not entirely different. It's just proceeding down the route. It's the same process. If you're looking at those arrowed loops on the side, collecting data, analyzing data, putting data to work, all of those are the same thing as year 1. And it was just the same process that we were asking our staff to employ, just with a different level of course level outcomes. So in year 2, we're in that process now. We're in that cycle now. We're looking at reinforced or outcomes that we believe should be reinforced. And when I say reinforced, meaning by the end of this course, students will achieve a level or that the outcome will have been reinforced in some way. So that being said, in the culinary department, one skill that program advisory committee identified that was absolutely paramount for their organizations was this idea of knife skills. So in our culinary management, either certificate or degree, you see an outcome related to knife skills in that spans the level of difficulty from emphasis all the way down to introduction. So that being said, that's where those levels came into play. Yet the cycle and the process was exactly the same, even though now we're at a different level of outcomes. So if you could go to the next slide. Okay, and this says business as usual because we hope that by next year, when we get through all of the introductory level, course level outcome assessments, that we'll have then a full 3-year cycle to kind of really reflect on. And by the end of year 3, that means that we should have enough data to be very impactful. So again, just furthering that idea of being meaningful. And, you really see that reviewing those outcomes. So as we go through this 3-year cycle at our college, and I'm sure many other institutions, there's certainly an internal process for making adjustments to courses when it comes to the outcomes and, the ICCB approvals and such. And so, starting with those emphasis and then drilling it down to the introductory level outcomes, that cycle is allowing us to also keep up with then being able to edit those programs where it needs to happen, if that's what staff is identifying and staff and program advisory committee folks are identifying need to happen. If you could go ahead and advance the slide one more. I think I'm going to pass the torch to Nancy. This was a tool that she created and I think was super helpful. So I'll let her continue on with this one.
So like Sheridan mentioned, we kind of do each year between when we determine that a course outcome is at the introductory level. Is this the first time a students had seen it? Are we at a reinforcement level within a course, or is this kind of the second or third time a student's seen it? And the idea being with that emphasis last level, just kind of conclude and wrap up what she was saying, we align the emphasis level with being something an entry-level professional should be fairly competent at. Somebody that's operating kind of at that A game level that an employer can be very excited to hire because they should be seen as a trained entry-level worker. Those are what those emphasis level outcomes are matched to. The introductory one, so utilizing Sheridan's example with knife skills, an introductory one might be just learning how to properly hold and care for a knife and do some very, very basic knife skills. Whereas at that emphasis level, they're going to need to be able to do a variety of knife cuts, both quality and quantity, and within a timed amount, whereby it's something that would be acceptable within a professional environment. So that's how we kind of split up those outcomes. So again, we wanted a process that was kind of like, here's step one, here's step two, here's step three. Do a little thinking, do it, implement it, and do it again was kind of our idea. So with this course report, and I think that we're going to be able to share that, it just kind of lets them pull that information where they think there's something they need to review. Our courses kind of work on mods, so every 8 weeks, and a faculty person may have one course in one semester. They may have 3 courses in one semester, but it's doubtful they would have every single outcome in one semester. So again, we're trying to make it manageable. And with our programs, you're often going to see the same classes in the fall as in the spring due to our cohort model, which allows us to do some mini data analysis reflection within each year of our 3-year cycle. So Sheridan mentioned, at the end of the 3-year, we can have some really impactful takeaways that could involve, big changes to programs based on what we're seeing from industry. But because we're able to implement within the course of 1 year, you're able to see if any of your action plans have worked. So with this, we have them, look at those course learning outcomes, because if sometimes you kind of gloss over those and you're really more focused on your just your daily schedule, right? So we want them to look at their course schedule, make sure that they understand what's being assessed. We want to encourage them to provide multiple opportunities for assessment, so multiple measures. So identifying that you're really spending the right amount of time on that. And from there, some of it's just some housekeeping, of course, but we identify that the course learning outcome, we put in our measurement tool, we determine our benchmark, we look at our results, and we put our action plan in. And then the following time you look at that class, we're going to pull that document up. We house it kind of in teams, and they're able to put some information in there. So for example, a course learning outcome, we'll use, again, knife skills, for instance. And Sheridan's been most closely with this. She might want to talk about this one, but she can kind of talk about the benchmark that she put in and what those results are and what her action plan was.
Yeah, so specific to knife skills, again, you're hearing that. In our emphasis level course, the outcome specifically states demonstrate competency and management of others and operations in a professional kitchen. And that being said, as Nancy mentioned, when you get to the end of our trajectory in our programs here in Workforce Institute, we're expecting students to be, or I should say the A students, the go-getter students, are entering with a good quality trained productivity for the task at hand. So that being said, you kind of have to back into that, right? So we have done our best to then give students, not just within the same course, multiple opportunities to touch on that particular course learning outcome, but across courses. So in Food Pro 4, which is where the outcome that I just mentioned, that's at the end of students' time in our program, they are, we're asking them to function like a professional, or more like a professional, and that's where that assessment piece comes into play. And it was the moment that we saw students leaving our program with not enough knife skills, and we kept hearing from program advisory committee members that just in general in our industry, that was a skill that was super important. We said, hey, that's an action that we can absolutely implement tomorrow. If students need to come into that introductory level course where they see an outcome related to knife skills straight out of the gate, well, they need to practice that every single class period so that they get it with automaticity. And that I think is kind of true and applicable across all trade sort of industries, is that we really have to channel outcomes that are meaningful. And then when we look at the assessment piece of it, meaning how many of the students were able to achieve that learning outcome at the level we expect them to achieve, we can then build more opportunities for learning if we didn't get the result we really wanted. And that was something that we saw. I was like, well, why don't we just have students, as when they walk in the door, come in and chop an onion? That will improve their automaticity. It costs relatively, very little. And then once they leave that introductory level course, they have a stronger foundation on a few knife cuts than when they go to the next course and we've raised the bar to that reinforced level outcome. Then we're expecting them to add more knife cuts to their number that they had leaving the first course. And then when they get to the Food Pro 4 that I mentioned, kind of their capstone course, then we're expecting them to function with that kind of automaticity like you would expect someone working, in a commercial kitchen out in our industry. And in addition to that, what I failed to mention earlier is that within each of those I's and R's and E's for introduce, reinforce, and emphasize, we assigned a collective numbering system within those. So 4 meaning the students function, they've either practiced enough or maybe they already have some skills coming into the programs, or they're just a great student and they take it upon themselves to really dig into the skills of the program, and they function like a 4, like an industry person, like someone that you don't have to coach on that particular skill. And then the idea of 4 being the top, then down from that 3 is that kind of entry level professional. 2 is approaching professional. 1 meaning you really need more practice with this. And we put in the 0 just as a non-measure, a non-score if the student, exited the course or whatnot, so that they wouldn't be impacting the assessment data in a negative way. So those kind of numbers, when we can numerically assign those benchmark results, then it becomes easier to create a plan of action. And that's what assessment should be. It's about the action, not so much about how many times even we collect data, or how many times the students have an opportunity to practice that that particular skill.
And to take away from the culinary side, so we can give another example, let's use welding, for example. So for instance, like to fill this course learning outcome, maybe it's the student has to perform a visual inspection of their weld, right? They need to determine if there's any failures. And so their benchmark, we determined that a 4 is that a student can properly identify any failures within the weld. So maybe, and then it worked from there, a 3 might be a student can properly identify 80% of the failures and work from there. They might set their benchmark as they want 80% of the students to be able to operate as a 4, to be able to identify any failures within a weld. For instance, in our welding class, that wasn't achieved. So the instructor had to think through, okay, what am I going to do to meet that benchmark next time when I do this class again? And so the instructor decided, instead of just doing that kind of black or white assessment of did you meet or did you not, they'd incorporate a second component, which be to include a kind of a written inspection, having them reflect upon their visual inspection to determine, okay, this where my failures were, this is what the problem was, this is what I would do different next time. So that encompassed several things. One, it added a bit of literacy, right? Writing into that lab assignment. It also added to writing a report, a weld report within the work environment might be something that replicates exactly what was going on. And the third part was it gave that student a time for reflection. Because when you can give students, that time for reflection, it kind of enhances and reinforces learning because they're able to critically think about what they did with that piece of learning and maybe what they missed out on and where they'd want to go in the future. So that was that one instructor's analysis to see, okay, we didn't hit that benchmark where we want 80% of our students at that level 4, and the action plan they put in to help reinforce the learning for next time. And so this coming fall, we'll see what happened, added that extra component to our benchmark. And I think we can probably advance on to the slide from now. You guys all have access to that. But these are kind of livable working documents. So, and actually, if you want to click it one more time, I kind of already started talking about the small changes and big celebrations, just something small like that. Adding to that kind of reflective component is a small change that can create a big win. So it may be that instructor kind of created a little bit of a change in what they were doing to try to increase the learning on that. Another way is, to increase the active learning opportunities to get students really thinking about what they're doing, not just being instructors being that sage on the stage, right? Instead being a facilitator on the side to encourage students to be more interactive with their learning. That could be a change in a delivery method. The other thing is really utilizing the program advisory feedback. So we're getting ready to have an automotive tech program advisory meeting. And so we're going to talk about some of our assessments within one of our courses to determine some courses of action of what we can do to improve some things. We may make a course more rigorous and put it at the end due to us not meeting some benchmarks and thinking through the needs of our industry. We may create another course. It's a more 1 credit introductory to shop class. So that we can kind of start the introduction of certain skill sets earlier. So we have more opportunity throughout the time to reinforce those. So we're better meeting benchmarks that we haven't been. And like I mentioned, more student reflection.
And I just have to chime in, in the process of developing assessment, both Nancy and myself did a lot of cheerleading for our staff. Like so we shared that tool with you and we got some tools that had great data, great analysis, great reflection, great action. And we got some that wasn't. And we tried to really just among our staff celebrate the examples that were powerful, that however small or big they were, just be cheerleaders of each other for, taking that leap or just putting into focus something so important as assessment and doing it and then actually using it and making it meaningful was not only, I think, fun for both Nancy and I to see, but I think fun for those that took it to heart too. So cheering, I can't stress enough, if you're launching assessment at your particular institution, a lot of cheerleading may be important in the area of taking action against data.
And if you want to advance one more time. We also implemented quick check-in meetings. We didn't want to have it to be an hour-long meeting that staff would just be like, oh, another assessment meeting. Just a quick 15-minute check-in that says, were you able to get this done? Do you need some help with it? What were your biggest takeaways this semester? We kind of created for the first time an overall agenda for these one-on-one meetings. We wanted them to really think about the quality of their outcomes, the quality of kind of their teaching / course schedule, to ensure the teaching and course schedule was aligned to outcomes in the right way and aligned to assessment. We want them to do a quick check of their data points to make sure they really were pulling data that made sense, that was usable, and a quick check-in for, hey, what do you think of your action plan? Because we didn't want it to be like, oh, the semester's over, I'll get to assessment when I get to it. But that quick 15 minutes to, again, be a cheerleader, be a motivator, and highlight the important points. Because sometimes that allowed those owners to kind of, again, have that motivation to take ownership of those action plans. And it kind of allowed us to kind of push, because oftentimes we'd see the answer of their action plan was, well, I just need more time in the lab. At what point do we realize, we have a finite amount of time? It's not just more time every time. It's increasing the rigor, increasing the quality, changing the delivery method is what those action plans should really look at. And then to, give a high five, celebrate wins, and say, hey, we've actually closed a loop here. We have, integrated a multitude of assessments using our industry partners to plug back in, increase value into this program. And as we continue to look through the cycle, we can see those long-term big changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to piggyback on what Nancy was saying, the small wins and the asking questions related to why we could celebrate those small wins rather than, I think she and I and Nancy was really great about saying, yeah, let's not offer too many suggestions. Let's really let them come to the aha moment. And so we tried to really make sure that we did that for our staff, like let them choose the direction that they wanted to go to, whether or not she and I saw, maybe some additional items that could be important to that analysis reflection. So I think really leading the staff to make their own path in this road of assessment is super important.
So if you want to advance. And so, all of this is about continuous quality improvement. If you advance one more time, it'll pull up our list here. Just, as we look to these and we put in our action plan, I guess there's a list, you can press again, they run on. There we go. Sure, we have action plans to put in place, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen with a snap of a finger. It may be that faculty person needs some assistance, some professional development. A lot of our instructors come from industry and they're excellent at what they do, and they've been trainers every day of their life, essentially. But flip that into a classroom, they're now standing in the classroom that's challenged them when they were in K through 12. And so giving them the tools they need to become true teachers. Some CTE teachers take to it like water, others, they need that little bit of help. And being able to give them that professional development, those opportunities. So within the classroom to become those quality teachers, but also to stay on top of the industry of what's going on. Also, we may realize that our equipment is quite deficient. So not just from the fact that students aren't meeting outcomes, but from feedback from program advisory meetings. That same thing has to do with technology as well, curriculum. So all of those aspects kind of go into that continuous quality improvement. We're not operating in a vacuum. We need outside help, outside resources, outside input to ensure we're having the latest, greatest supports and knowledge. And all of that leads, again, to evidence. I don't know when you guys do your HLC accreditations, but we're in coming up to kind of the crunch time of ours. And so all of this documentation is then helpful for those accreditation, from HLC to providing, credible evidence of why we want to spend our Perkins money the way we do and our Perkins reports, institutional budget requests, program review time. Those of you doing programs of study work, all of this data and continuous quality improvement support those things. With this, there is, a lot of documentation, but it's like Sheridan said, that initial getting started, and either of us would be happy to kind of help you, because like we said, we've actually heard faculty say, this makes sense, and this is actually pretty easy, which to me, that's a really big win. Sheridan, any last words from you before we wrap up for questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think that maybe academia in general sometimes focuses on making something perfect rather than jumping right in. I know I'm guilty of that myself. And I appreciate our process was to dive right in. And I would encourage anybody who's trying to tackle this, absolutely, as Nancy said, like reach out if you need help in how to dive in. Because knock on wood, so far, our assessment process is going well. So thank you for listening and thank you for your time. And certainly, you know, as Nancy mentioned earlier, our process is alive. And if anyone has any feedback for us, we'd be happy to hear it, or any suggestions on our end too.
I put my email in, you know, sharing kind of that process, mapping those outcomes from courses to programs, crosswalking those and kind of showing how we implement those IR&Es and how we make kind of that schedule by semester. We're happy to talk with anybody about that as well. And I'll put Sheridan's email in here.
I don't see any questions at the moment, but what I can do is I can make some announcements and participants can write questions in the chat as they think of them while I'm announcing, and then we can sort of see what we have when I finish. So thank you for attending the forum. Please be sure to provide feedback on this session by clicking on the rate session button in the Whova app. We also would like to take this time to direct you to our on-demand sessions, which you can access at any time during or after this conference. You can access those by locating the resources tab on your Whova app and then clicking on demand. Feel free to follow us on social media as well for all things forum, including engagement and giveaways. And Dawn just posted those hashtags in the chat box. I don't see any questions in the chat. So before I close this out, do you have anything else to add, Nancy and Sheridan?
No, just reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Bye.